Why you see shadows. When you wake up, you open your eyes. The room is drenched in absolute darkness, thick, impenetrable darkness. Your heart pounds before you even understand why, before thought can form, before reason can intervene. Something stands at the edge of your bed, watching, waiting, silent. You can't see a face, but you know it's there. You feel it with a certainty that bypasses logic. Every fiber of your being screams danger. Your muscles tense, your breath catches, your skin prickles with ancient recognition. But when you reach for the light, when your trembling hand finds the switch, when illumination floods the room in an instant, nothing. Only furniture, only the chair draped with yesterday's clothes, only shadows cast by ordinary objects, only the rapid drumming of your pulse reminding you that for a moment you were certain, absolutely certain, beyond any doubt. Someone was there, something was watching, and now you're left alone with the question that echoes in the silence. What did I just see? This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore whispered around campfires. This is not superstition passed down through generations. This is neuroscience colliding with primal terror. This is psychology meeting evolution at the intersection of consciousness. This is your brain, magnificent and ancient, doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting you from threats that no longer exist, seeing danger in harmless darkness, creating meaning from meaningless shadows. The phenomenon you experienced has a name, a scientific designation, a place in medical literature: hypnopompic hallucination, the moment between sleep and waking when your mind hasn't quite decided which world is real, when the veil between imagination and perception dissolves like smoke, when the boundary separating dream from reality becomes permeable, transparent, non-existent. Scientists have studied it for decades. Sleep laboratories across the world have documented thousands upon thousands of cases. Neurologists have mapped the exact regions of your brain that conspire to create these phantom visitors. They've identified the neural pathways. They've measured the brain waves. They've reproduced the conditions in controlled environments. And yet, knowing the mechanism doesn't diminish the terror. Understanding the science doesn't erase the memory. Because when you see that shadow, when you feel that presence, logic doesn't exist yet. Reason hasn't arrived. Only instinct, only survival, only the ancient machinery of fear, older than language itself. The mechanism. Your brain is a storyteller, the greatest storyteller that has ever existed. It abhors emptiness. It despises uncertainty. It cannot tolerate gaps in the narrative of perception. So when you wake in darkness, when sensory information is scarce, when data is incomplete, your visual cortex begins to improvise. It fills the void with patterns, with shapes, with meaning drawn from memory and expectation. This is called pareidolia, the tendency to perceive familiar forms in random stimuli. The face in the clouds that watches you from above. The figure in the wallpaper that seems to shift when you look away. The Virgin Mary in a piece of toast. The man in the moon who has gazed down at humanity for millennia. The watcher in the darkness. All manifestations of the same cognitive process. Your occipital lobe, still sluggish from sleep, still transitioning from dream state to waking consciousness, receives fragmented visual data. Shadows bleeding into darker shadows. Dim outlines barely distinguishable from surrounding darkness. The faint geometry of furniture reduced to ambiguous shapes. But your brain doesn't wait for complete information. It can't afford to. It cannot pause to gather more data, to confirm or deny its initial impressions. So it guesses. It extrapolates from insufficient evidence. It constructs a complete picture from incomplete fragments. It fills in the blanks with the most likely scenario. And what does it construct most readily? What pattern does it impose on ambiguous stimuli? Human forms. Always human forms. Because for millions of years, spanning countless generations, the most important thing to recognize in darkness wasn't a tree or a rock or a distant mountain. It was another person, another human being who could be predator or protector, threat or tribe member, enemy or ally. Your survival depended on answering that question instantly, correctly, without hesitation, and your brain still carries that ancient programming etched into its architecture by eons of natural selection, written in the DNA of every neuron, preserved because it worked, because those who possessed it survived. The evolutionary architecture. Imagine the African savanna 300,000 years ago, the birthplace of our species, the crucible where human cognition was forged. Night falls. Darkness is absolute, unbroken by artificial light. No street lamps, no phone screens, no distant city glow, only the stars above and the dying embers of a fire. Your ancestors huddled together, seeking warmth and safety in numbers. They listened to the sounds of the African night. Every rustle in the tall grass could be nothing. Wind moving through vegetation, a small animal foraging, or it could be a lion, a leopard descending from the trees, a rival clan approaching with violent intent, death approaching on silent feet through the darkness. Those who ignored the shadows, who dismissed the rustling as harmless, who failed to investigate ambiguous stimuli, they didn't pass on their genes. They became statistics in evolution's brutal calculus. calculus. Those who saw threats, even imaginary ones, lived to see morning. They survived to reproduce, to pass their genes and their cautious neural architecture to the next generation. False positives kept you alive. You wasted energy fleeing from nothing. You spent a sleepless night on high alert. You exhausted yourself with vigilance, but you survived. False negatives killed you. You slept soundly through genuine danger. You dismissed the rustling as wind. You ignored the shadow that was actually a predator, and you died. Evolution doesn't care about your peace of mind. It doesn't optimize for comfort or tranquility. It optimizes for survival and reproduction, and survival favors the paranoid. So your brain evolved with a bias, a systematic error that nonetheless saved lives. A nervous system calibrated to err on the side of caution, a perceptual apparatus that would rather you see 1,000 phantoms than miss one genuine threat. This is why your amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped cluster deep in your brain, ignites before your prefrontal cortex can even process the scene. Fear arrives first, instantaneous and overwhelming. Reason stumbles in later, apologizing for the delay, trying to calm the panic. By the time you can think clearly, your body has already prepared for battle or flight. Your heart rate has already spiked. Your muscles have already flooded with oxygen-rich blood. Your pupils have already dilated to capture more light. Your entire physiology has shifted into survival mode, all because of a shadow. The intruder illusion. Neuroscientists call it the sensed presence effect, the overwhelming conviction that someone else occupies the space with you. Not a vague feeling of unease, not a passing anxiety that something might be wrong, a concrete embodied certainty that you are not alone. It emerges from a glitch in your temporoparietal junction, the region that constructs your sense of bodily self in space. This area integrates information from multiple sources: proprioception telling you where your limbs are positioned, vestibular input providing information about balance and orientation, visual data confirming what you see, auditory cues locating sounds in three-dimensional space. All of this information normally aligns perfectly, creating a seamless sense of self. You know where you are, you know where you end and the world begins. The boundary is clear, unambiguous, stable. But when this area misfires, when it becomes confused by contradictory signals from your sleep-addled nervous system, something remarkable happens, something that reveals the constructed nature of consciousness itself. Your brain creates a duplicate, a copy of your own spatial presence projected outward into the environment. You sense yourself twice, once in your body where you expect to be, once in the corner of the room where nothing should be. The second self becomes the other, the watcher, the intruder, the presence that shouldn't exist but undeniably does. Dr. Olaf Blanke at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology demonstrated this with electrical stimulation. In a groundbreaking series of experiments, he applied targeted current to the temporoparietal junction of awake patients undergoing brain surgery. The results were immediate and dramatic. Patients reported sensing someone behind them, always behind, always just out of sight, always watching. The presence was so convincing, so real, that patients would turn around expecting to see a person standing there. But there was only empty space, only the sterile environment of the operating room, only their own minds, fragmented and projected, staring back at them through the illusion of separation. When the stimulation stopped, the presence vanished instantly. When it resumed, the presence returned. The phantom visitor could be switched on and off like a light. This wasn't belief or imagination or wishful thinking. This was neurology. This was the brain's spatial mapping system glitching in real time. This was consciousness revealing its mechanisms. The paralysis visitor. Sometimes the experience intensifies beyond mere shadows, beyond the simple sense of presence. You wake, but your body doesn't. Sleep paralysis, a phenomenon experienced by millions but understood by few. Your consciousness surfaces while your muscles remain locked in REM atonia, the biological paralysis that prevents you from acting out dreams. During REM sleep, your brain chemically paralyzes your voluntary muscles. This is a safety mechanism. Without it, you would physically enact your dreams. You would punch, kick, run, gesture. You would injure yourself or others. So evolution installed a cutoff switch, a temporary disconnection between intention and action. But sometimes the timing fails. Sometimes consciousness returns while the paralysis persists. You can't move. You can't speak. You can barely breathe against the weight pressing down on your chest. And there in the corner, or standing over you, or sitting on your chest with malevolent intent, a figure. The shadow person takes solid form. It becomes three-dimensional, concrete, undeniable, sometimes faceless, a void in the shape of a human, sometimes with burning eyes that bore into your soul, sometimes with features too terrible to remember clearly afterward, sometimes simply a mass of darkness that radiates menace. Studies show that up to 40% of people experience sleep paralysis at least once in their lives. Nearly half of all humans will know this terror firsthand, and among those who experience paralysis, 75% report the presence of an entity, an intruder, a demon, a shadow person watching from the darkness. The numbers are staggering when you consider consider them, millions of people across every culture, every continent, every era of human history encountering the same visitor, the same dark figure, the same malevolent presence. The Japanese call it kanashibari, bound by metal, unable to move as if shackled. In Newfoundland, it's the old hag who sits on your chest, crushing the breath from your lungs. In Mexico, subirse el muerto, the dead climb on you, pressing you down into darkness. In Cambodia, the ghost pushes you down. In Turkey, karabasan, the dark presser. In Egypt, al-jathum, different names across different languages, different cultural frameworks for understanding. Same phenomenon, same neural mechanism, same shadow. The documented cases. In 2005, neurologist J. Allen Cheney published a comprehensive study analyzing over 13,000 sleep paralysis accounts collected from individuals worldwide. The database represented decades of research, thousands of first-hand testimonies, a catalogue of humanity's encounters with the shadow. One case stood particularly vivid in the literature. A 28-year-old woman, healthy with no psychiatric history, no history of trauma or drug use, woke in the early hours unable to move. She described the sensation of being pinned to her mattress by an invisible force. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Panic rose in her chest, but her body refused to respond. In her doorway stood a figure, impossibly tall, reaching nearly to the ceiling, featureless, without discernible face or clothing, darker than the surrounding darkness, as if it absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply existed, a vertical column of void occupying space where nothing should be. And she knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that bypassed reason entirely, that it was malevolent, that it meant her harm, that it had come specifically for her. The episode lasted 90 seconds according to the clock on her nightstand. 90 seconds that felt like hours. 90 seconds of absolute helplessness. When she could finally move, when the paralysis released her all at once, she leaped from bed. She turned on every light in her apartment. She checked every closet, every corner, every space where something might hide. The presence had vanished, but the memory remained, seared into her mind with the clarity of actual experience, more vivid than many real events, more detailed than most mundane memories, because to her brain it was actual experience, real sensory data, real threat, real terror. Another case documented by sleep researcher Dr. Brian Sharpless at Penn State University, a combat veteran recently returned from deployment in Afghanistan, experienced nightly visitations, every night without fail, a shadow figure standing at parade rest at the foot of his bed, military posture, hands clasped behind its back, watching him with the patience of a sentry, same position every time, same silent vigil. He knew it wasn't real. His rational mind understood the mechanism. He had been briefed on PTSD symptoms, on the effects of combat stress on sleep architecture. He recognized it as a hallucination born from trauma and hypervigilance, but understanding didn't dispel the vision. Knowledge didn't make it any less present. The shadow appeared regardless, night after night after night, until his sleep improved through treatment, until his stress diminished through therapy and time, until his nervous system finally felt safe enough to stop posting sentries in the darkness, until his brain no longer believed it was in a war zone. Only then did the figure fade. Only then did his nights become his own again. The pattern across populations. The phenomenon transcends individual experience. It's not random. It's not arbitrary. It emerges in predictable patterns across populations, following the contours of stress and exhaustion. ICU patients subjected to constant monitoring, beeping machines, interrupted sleep cycles, and existential fear. They report the bedroom. Intruder at rates 3 times higher than the general population. The combination of sleep deprivation, medication effects, and life-threatening illness creates perfect conditions for hypnopompic hallucinations. Medical students during exam periods, residents working 30-hour shifts, new parents in the first months of infancy, stumbling through days and nights that blur together, grief-stricken individuals in the weeks following loss, when sleep becomes fragmented by sorrow, soldiers on extended deployments in hostile territory, long-haul truck drivers pushing past exhaustion, anyone whose nervous system is running on fumes, anyone whose stress hormones are chronically elevated, anyone whose brain is desperately seeking threat in an unpredictable world. The shadows appear most vividly when you are most vulnerable, when your defenses are lowest, when your resources are depleted. Dr. Christopher French at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit in London conducted extensive surveys revealing that disrupted sleep patterns predicted paranormal experiences better than any personality trait or belief system, better than religiosity, better than openness to experience, better than any demographic factor. It wasn't about whether you believed in ghosts or spirits or demons. It wasn't about your cultural background or religious upbringing. It was about whether you were getting adequate REM sleep, whether your circadian rhythms were stable, whether your nervous system had time to recover between stressors. The skeptic and the believer experienced the same visions when pushed to the same same state of exhaustion. The materialist and the mystic saw the same shadows. The brain doesn't discriminate based on philosophy. It doesn't check your beliefs before generating hallucinations. It simply responds to conditions, to physiological states, to the balance of neurotransmitters and hormones. The cultural interpretation. Here is where science diverges from lived experience, where the laboratory meets the bedroom, where data confronts meaning. Science says neural misfiring, evolutionary programming, hypnopompic hallucination, temporoparietal junction dysfunction, clean categories, measurable phenomena, reproducible results. But the person lying in bed at 3 a.m., staring at a shadow that stares back with palpable malevolence, they feel something else entirely, something that resists reduction to mechanism, something that seems to carry meaning beyond neurology. Across cultures, spanning continents and centuries, humans have woven these experiences into mythology. Spirits of the dead visiting the living to deliver messages or warnings, demons testing the faithful, seeking points of entry into the soul, interdimensional beings slipping through cracks in reality during the vulnerable hours, the night hag of European folklore pressing down on sleepers' chests, the jinn of Middle Eastern tradition, creatures of smokeless fire who walk between worlds, the shadow people of contemporary urban legend, entities glimpsed in peripheral vision, the hmongs, dab tsog, the oppressing spirit, Native American tales of nightwalkers, African accounts of nocturnal visitations, different narratives explaining the same neurological event, different frameworks for understanding, different languages for articulating the experience, and perhaps that's not entirely wrong. Perhaps the cultural interpretations aren't simply errors to be corrected by science, because while the mechanism is biological, the experience is genuinely meaningful. It touches something real in human psychology. These shadows appear during our most vulnerable hours. They emerge when we are isolated, afraid, exhausted, grieving. They manifest when our defenses are down. They represent, in embodied form, our deepest anxieties made visible, the fear of the unknown that lurks beyond the circle of firelight, the terror of being watched by hostile eyes, the dread of something wrong that we can't quite identify, the existential loneliness of consciousness. They are metaphors made manifest, psychological truths wearing shadow flesh, internal states projected outward and given form. The question of purpose. But why? Why would evolution design a brain that terrifies its owner? Why program us to see threats that don't exist in any physical sense? Why burden us with phantom visitors and imaginary watchers? The answer lies in cost-benefit analysis, written in blood across millennia of survival. Natural selection is a brutal accountant. It calculates only in terms of reproductive success. It preserves traits that increase the odds of passing on genes. It eliminates traits that decrease those odds. The cost of a false alarm, elevated heart rate for a few minutes, disrupted sleep, momentary fear and adrenaline surge, unpleasant but not fatal, exhausting but survivable. The cost of missing a real threat, death, removal from the gene pool, evolutionary extinction. Evolution doesn't optimize for comfort or peace of mind. It doesn't care about your quality of life. It doesn't value your psychological well-being, except insofar as it affects your ability to survive and reproduce. And survival favors the paranoid. It rewards those who see danger even when none exists, those who wake at every sound, those who investigate every shadow, those who maintain vigilance even at the cost of rest. So we inherited a brain with a hair trigger, a nervous system calibrated to err on the side of caution, a perceptual apparatus that would rather you see 1,000 phantoms than miss one genuine threat. A threat detection system with sensitivity turned to maximum. This is not a design flaw. This is not evidence of incompetent engineering. This is design. Brilliance, forged in the crucible of predation and survival. You exist because your ancestors saw shadows, because they jumped at sounds, because they felt watched even when alone, because they couldn't quite convince themselves that the darkness was empty. You continue to see them because that vigilance is your birthright. It's encoded in your DNA. It's built into the architecture of your nervous system. It's the price of being descended from survivors rather than victims. The modern context. But here's the cruel irony that defines our contemporary experience. The world that shaped this response no longer exists. The environment that made these adaptations useful has vanished. You don't sleep in a cave, vulnerable to nocturnal predators prowling outside. You don't live in a world where shadows genuinely conceal approaching danger. You don't face the threats your ancestors faced. Yet your brain hasn't received the memo. It hasn't updated its software. It still operates on Pleistocene protocols in a modern apartment. It still scans for saber-toothed cats in suburban bedrooms. It still searches for hostile tribe members in the hallway. So the shadow person appears not because there's genuine threat, not because anything is actually wrong in your immediate environment, but because your stress levels, your sleep deprivation, your chronic anxiety mimic the conditions of ancient peril. Your nervous system can't distinguish between deadline pressure and lion threat, between social isolation and exile from the tribe, between financial insecurity and famine, between pandemic uncertainty and plague, between political anxiety and tribal warfare. The hormones are the same. The neural activation patterns are identical. The physiological responses match perfectly. And so the brain deploys its ancient defenses, including the sentinel shadow, the phantom guard, the visitor who warns you that something is wrong, even if that something is simply your own depleted nervous system crying out for rest, even if the threat is chronic stress rather than acute danger, even if what's hunting you is existential dread rather than a physical predator. The warning sign. This is the plot twist that changes everything. The shadow person is not your enemy. It is not a demon or spirit or interdimensional entity. It is your alarm system, your internal warning mechanism, your nervous system's way of communicating that something is wrong. When those dark figures begin appearing with regularity, when the visitations become frequent rather than rare, your brain is communicating something essential. You are running on empty. Your reserves are depleted. Your stress is unsustainable. Your sleep is inadequate. Your nervous system is frayed. Your resilience is exhausted. The shadows are symptoms, not causes. They emerge from the same conditions that produce anxiety, depression, physical illness. They're companions to burnout, harbingers of breakdown. Sleep researchers have found direct correlations. The more disrupted your sleep architecture, the more vivid the hallucinations. The higher your baseline cortisol levels, the more frequent the visitations. The more socially isolated you become, the more likely you are to sense presences. The longer you push past your limits, the more solid the shadows become. Your brain is trying to tell you something. It's sending up flares, it's sounding alarms. It speaks in the only language available at 3 a.m. when reason sleeps. Primal imagery, archetypal forms, shadows that demand attention, presences that cannot be ignored. It's saying, stop, rest, recover, before something breaks, before the shadows become permanent fixtures, before the warning becomes a crisis. The path forward. So what do you do when you wake to darkness and see the figure standing there? What's the appropriate response to these phantom visitors? First, understand, you are not losing your mind. You are not experiencing psychosis or schizophrenia. You are not broken or damaged or malfunctioning. You are experiencing a phenomenon documented across human history, measurable in brain scans, reproducible in sleep laboratories. You are exquisitely, perfectly human. You are experiencing what millions of others have experienced, what your ancestors experienced countless times, what people across every culture have described in their own terms. Second, recognize the message beneath the metaphor. If shadows are appearing regularly, assess your life honestly. Are you sleeping enough, not just total hours, but quality sleep with complete REM cycles? Are you managing stress effectively, or letting it accumulate without release or processing? Are you maintaining social connection, or sliding into isolation while telling yourself you're fine? Are you pushing your nervous system past its limits, ignoring signs of exhaustion because you think you should be tougher? The shadows will recede when the conditions change. This has been demonstrated repeatedly in clinical settings. When combat veterans receive effective trauma treatment, when PTSD symptoms diminish, the bedroom intruders vanish. When medical residents finally get adequate sleep during time off, the figures stop appearing. When grieving individuals find support and begin healing, the presences fade. When chronic stress is addressed through therapy, medication, lifestyle changes, the shadows lose their solidity. The shadows are conditional. They respond to your internal state. They fluctuate with your well-being. They intensify when you're struggling. They diminish when you're thriving. They're barometers of your nervous system's health. The deeper mystery. But there remains something profound in these experiences, something that transcends the neat explanations of neuroscience, something that resists reduction to mechanism alone, because even knowing the mechanism, even understanding the evolutionary logic, even after reading the studies and learning the terminology, the experience itself retains power. It carries weight that purely physical explanations don't quite capture. In that moment of encounter, you touch something ancient. You feel the weight of evolutionary history pressing down. You connect with every human who ever woke in darkness and wondered, what watches me while I sleep? Am I truly alone? What lurks beyond the edge of perception? These experiences remind us that we are not purely rational beings, that beneath our modern consciousness, beneath our scientific literacy and technological sophistication, lies something older, stranger, more fundamental. The shadows show us that our minds are vast territories, much of which remains unmapped, unexplored, mysterious even to ourselves. That consciousness is not a simple on-off switch, but a spectrum, a gradient, a liminal space where boundaries dissolve. That the line between waking and dreaming is blurrier than we usually acknowledge. That perception and imagination aren't as separate as we pretend. The existential dimension. And perhaps there's something else, something that the purely neurological explanation misses. Perhaps these shadow visitations speak to a deeper human need, the fear of being alone that haunts our species, the longing for witness to our existence, even a dark witness, even a terrifying one, because a presence, even a malevolent one, confirms that you exist, that your experience experience matters, that you are seen even if only by fragments of your own mind. Psychologists have noted that sensed presence experiences often occur during profound isolation. Mountaineers climbing alone at extreme altitude, oxygen-deprived and exhausted. Solo sailors on endless oceans, surrounded by water in every direction. Prisoners in solitary confinement, deprived of human contact. Explorers in remote locations far from civilization. People who report that in their darkest hours they sensed someone with them, sometimes terrifying, sometimes comforting, sometimes neutral, just present, always deeply powerfully real. The brain, pushed to extremes, refuses to let you be completely alone. It conjures company, even if that company wears shadow skin. It generates presence, even if that presence brings fear, because perhaps at some deep level, being watched is better than being invisible. Being hunted is better than being forgotten. Terror is better than absolute solitude. The scientific poetry. There's poetry in the science itself. If you look closely, your temporoparietal junction creating a double of yourself. Your own spatial presence reflected and projected outward. You are literally seeing yourself from outside. Your consciousness, fragmented and externalized. The watcher and the watched, both you. The subject and object, indistinguishable. This is your mind showing you its own architecture, revealing the constructed nature of selfhood, demonstrating that the you experience is an integration, a synthesis, a story your brain tells itself. And when that story fragments, when the integration falters, you multiply, you become plural, you encounter yourself as other. The philosophers would call this profound. The mystics would call it revelation. The neuroscientists call it temporoparietal junction dysfunction. All three are correct. The universality. Consider the remarkable consistency. From Japan to Jamaica, from Iceland to Indonesia, from ancient Egypt to modern America, the shadow person appears, not culturally transmitted, not taught or learned, arising independently from the structure of human neurology itself. This is not a meme or tradition or belief system. This is human nature expressing itself, the same brain architecture producing the same experience, a human universal like language or music or the recognition of faces. When sleep, researchers interview people from isolated communities with no knowledge of Western sleep paralysis research. They describe the same figure, the same darkness, the same malevolent presence, the same certainty of being watched. The details vary slightly based on cultural context, but the core experience remains identical. This tells us something important, that our minds, despite cultural differences, operate on the same fundamental principles. That consciousness, across all its variations, follows similar patterns, that we are all experiencing reality through the same basic perceptual machinery, the personal meaning. But perhaps the most important aspect isn't universal, it's personal. What do your shadows mean? Not shadows in general, not the abstract phenomenon documented in research papers. Your specific shadows, the ones that visit your bedroom, the ones that watch you in your most vulnerable moments. What are they telling you about your life? What needs are they expressing? What warnings are they issuing? Because while the mechanism is universal, the message is individual. Your shadows appear under your specific conditions. They emerge from your unique combination of stresses, fears, and exhaustions. They're shaped by your personal history and current circumstances. A veteran's shadow carries the weight of combat trauma. A grief-stricken person's shadow carries the weight of loss. An overworked professional's shadow carries the weight of burnout. A lonely individual's shadow carries the weight of isolation. Same phenomenon, different meanings, different messages. The invitation. So the shadows are inviting you to pay attention, to look at what you've been ignoring, to feel what you've been suppressing, to acknowledge what you've been denying. They're asking you to slow down, to rest, to recover, to reconnect, to address the imbalances in your life before they become crises. They're offering you information about your internal state, data that your rational mind might be dismissing or minimizing. They're saying something is wrong, not catastrophically wrong, not irreparably wrong, but wrong enough to warrant attention, wrong enough to generate symptoms, wrong enough that your nervous system is crying out in the only way it knows how. The transformation. And here's what's remarkable. When you listen, when you respond, when you make changes, the shadows change too. They become less frequent, less vivid, less threatening. They fade from solid figures to vague impressions, from nightly visitors to rare occurrences, from terrifying presences to curious anomalies. Not because you've convinced yourself they're not real, but because the conditions that generated them have improved. Your nervous system has found equilibrium, your stress has become manageable, your sleep has deepened, your connections have strengthened, and the shadows, no longer needed, retire. They return to the neural background where they belong, waiting, perhaps, for the next time you need their warning. The final revelation. So here is the truth. When you see shadows upon waking, you are witnessing your mind at its most naked, stripped of pretense and social performance, operating on pure survival instinct without the veneer of civilization, revealing the machinery that usually hums beneath awareness. You are watching evolution in action. You are experiencing the legacy of every ancestor ancestor who survived by seeing danger in darkness. You are touching the deepest architecture of human consciousness. The shadow person is not external. It never was. It is you. Your fear given form, your vigilance made visible, your exhausted nervous system doing its desperate best to keep you safe. It is the part of you that never sleeps, that always watches, that constantly scans for threat, the eternal guardian, the tireless sentinel, the aspect of consciousness that predates language and reason, the part of you that loves you enough to terrify you, to wake you, to remind you that survival requires vigilance, even when vigilance becomes exhausting, even when the threats are no longer physical, even when what's hunting you lives inside your own mind. The integration. The goal isn't to eliminate the shadows. You can't remove this aspect of your neurology. It's built in, it's fundamental, it's part of what makes you human. The goal is integration, understanding, relationship, seeing the shadows not as enemies, but as messengers, not as proof of breakdown, but as signs of your brain working exactly as designed, recognizing that these primitive responses, these ancient fears, these evolutionary hangovers, they're trying to help, they're trying to protect, they're trying to keep you alive in a world that no longer requires such extreme vigilance. So you thank them for their service. You acknowledge their message. You honor the impulse while not being ruled by it. You say, I see you, Shadow. I understand what you're trying to tell me, and I'm listening. The broader implications. These experiences reveal something crucial about consciousness itself, about the nature of reality as we perceive it, about the gap between what's out there and what we experience. Because if your brain can create such convincing hallucinations, figures so solid they seem to occupy space, presences so real, you'd swear on anything they exist, then what else might it be creating? What other aspects of your daily perception might be constructions rather than reflections? Philosophy has grappled with these questions for millennia, but now neuroscience provides concrete evidence. Your experience of reality is always mediated, always interpreted, always constructed by neural processes you'll never directly access. The shadow person is just the most dramatic example, the most obvious demonstration of your brain's creative role in perception, but it's happening all the time, in every moment, in every perception. Your brain is always guessing, always filling in gaps, always constructing a coherent narrative from incomplete data. You just don't usually notice. The shadows make it obvious. They pull back the curtain on the production. They show you the machinery in operation, the gift in. This way, the shadows are a gift, an uncomfortable one, a terrifying one, but a gift nonetheless. They give you insight into the nature of your own mind. They demonstrate the power of expectation and belief. They show you how context shapes perception. They reveal the difference between seeing and knowing. They prove that certainty can be divorced from accuracy, because you are certain the shadow is there, absolutely certain. Yet it isn't. What other certainties might be similarly unfounded? What other convictions might be constructions? This isn't meant to induce skepticism about everything, but rather to cultivate appropriate epistemic humility, to recognize the limits of perception, to understand that your experience, however vivid, is always mediated by fallible neural machinery, the compassion, and perhaps most importantly, these experiences should generate compassion for yourself first, for the times you wake in terror, heart-pounding, convinced of danger that doesn't exist. You're not weak, you're not broken, you're experiencing what humans have experienced for hundreds of thousands of years, but also compassion for others, for anyone who reports seeing things others don't see, for anyone whose perception diverges from consensus reality, because now you know how real hallucinations feel, how convincing they are, how impossible it is to dismiss them through reason alone. You understand that telling someone it's not real doesn't help, because it feels real. The neural activation is real, the experience is real, only the external referent is absent. This should change how we think about mental illness, about psychosis and schizophrenia and hallucinations, about the experiences of people whose perceptual reality differs from ours. They're not making it up. They're not seeking attention. They're experiencing what their brains are generating, just like you experience the shadow. Just as real, just as convincing, just as terrifying. The acceptance. So acceptance becomes important. Not resignation, not giving up, but genuine acceptance of what is. The shadows may come again, probably will in fact, during your next period of extreme stress or sleep deprivation, during illness or grief or major life transitions. They'll return because the conditions that generate them will return. That's life. Stress happens, sleep gets disrupted, crises emerge, and when they do, the shadows will follow. But now you'll recognize them. Now you'll understand what they mean. Now you'll see them not as supernatural visitations, but as biological signals, as messages from your nervous system that something needs attention. And that changes everything. Fear diminishes when you understand its source. Terror subsides when you recognize the mechanism, not completely. The experience will still activate your amygdala, still trigger your fight or flight response, but you'll recover faster. You'll contextualize more quickly. You'll move from panic to understanding in seconds rather than hours. The practice. Some people develop practice practices around these experiences, ways of working with them rather than against them. When they see the shadow, they pause, they breathe, they observe, they notice the fear without being consumed by it. They ask, what is this shadow trying to tell me? What have I been ignoring? What needs my attention? They treat it as information rather than threat, as signal rather than noise. This doesn't make the experience pleasant, but it makes it meaningful. It transforms terror into data, turns nightmare into message, converts vulnerability into opportunity for self-awareness. Some keep journals by their beds. When they wake to shadows, they write. They document the experience. They note what was happening in their lives, what stresses they were carrying, what sleep they'd been missing. And patterns emerge. The shadows correlate with work deadlines, with relationship conflicts, with financial anxiety, with illness. The journal becomes a map of their nervous system's triggers, a guide to their personal warning signs. The science continues. Research continues in sleep laboratories around the world. Scientists probe deeper into the mechanisms. They use fMRI to watch brains generate hallucinations in real time. They identify the exact sequences of neural activation. They test interventions, ways to reduce the frequency and intensity. Some promising approaches: cognitive behavioral therapy targeting sleep anxiety, improved sleep hygiene and consistent schedules, stress reduction through meditation or therapy, treatment of underlying sleep disorders like apnea, addressing trauma that keeps the nervous system on high alert. The research confirms what experience suggests. The shadows respond to lifestyle changes. They're not random or arbitrary. They follow the contours of well-being. When you take care of yourself, they diminish. When you neglect your needs, they intensify. Simple. Not easy, but simple. The cultural wisdom. Ancient cultures understood something we're rediscovering. They knew that visions and visitations carried meaning, that the boundary between worlds thinned during certain states, that shadows and spirits communicated messages. We dismissed this as superstition, as primitive misunderstanding, but perhaps they were interpreting correctly, even if their framework was different. Perhaps they recognized that these experiences mattered, that they carried psychological and social information, that they deserved attention and ritual and integration. Shamanic traditions involve deliberately inducing altered states, seeking visions, encountering spirits, bringing back messages for the community. We might frame it differently now. We might talk about activating specific neural networks, about accessing unconscious material, about integrating fragmented aspects of self, but the function is similar, using unusual states of consciousness to access information otherwise unavailable, using the shadow as teacher rather than threat. The mystery remains, but for all our scientific understanding, mystery remains. We can map the neural correlates, we can identify the neurotransmitters, we can reproduce the conditions, but we can't fully explain subjective experience itself. Why does neural activation feel like anything at all? Why is there an inner life, an experiential dimension? Why does consciousness exist? This is the hard problem of consciousness, and the shadows sit right at its center, because they demonstrate that experience and reality can diverge completely, that consciousness can generate entire presences from nothing, that the felt sense of something can be absolutely convincing yet absolutely wrong. This should humble us, should remind us how much we don't understand, how much remains mysterious about the mind, about awareness, about the strange fact of being something rather than nothing. The gratitude. Strange as it sounds, there's room for gratitude here. Gratitude that your brain works hard to protect you, that millions of years of evolution crafted these defenses, that you inherited a nervous system sophisticated enough to generate these experiences. Gratitude that you live in a time when these phenomena can be understood, when you don't have to believe you're cursed or possessed or going mad, when science offers explanations without dismissing the profundity of experience. Gratitude for the wake-up call, for the warning system that tells you when something's wrong, for the shadows that care enough to appear. Even gratitude for the fear, because fear kept your ancestors alive, and it's still trying to keep you alive even when the threats have changed form. The connection. And finally, there's connection. You are not alone in this. Millions have seen what you've seen. Millions have woken in terror to dark figures that shouldn't exist. Millions have felt that certainty of presence, that conviction of being watched across all of human history. In every culture, in every era, the shadow visitor is a human universal, part of our shared heritage, part of what it means to have a human brain. So when you see it next, remember, you're connected to everyone who has ever experienced this, to the medieval peasant who saw demons, to the African elder who encountered spirits, to the modern professional who woke to intruders, to the veteran with PTSD, to the grieving widow, to the exhausted parent, to the stressed student, all seeing their own version of the same shadow, all touching the same ancient neural circuitry, all human, all vulnerable, all trying to survive in a world that constantly challenges us. Closing the next time you wake in darkness, and you will, the room thick with shadow and silence, and you see that figure standing in the corner, and you will, that impossible shape that shouldn't exist but undeniably does. Remember remember this: you are not broken. You are not haunted by external forces. You are magnificently, achingly human. You are the inheritor of billions of years of evolutionary wisdom. You are connected to every human who ever feared the dark, every ancestor who survived because they saw shadows where others saw nothing, every person who woke trembling and wondered if they were losing their mind. You are not alone in this experience. The shadow reminds you that your brain is a guardian, fierce and ancient, that your mind contains multitudes, not all of them gentle or comfortable, that consciousness is stranger and more complex than we dare imagine on ordinary days. So breathe, count your breaths if you need to. 1, 2, 3. Turn on the light. Let reason return like dawn breaking. Let the shadow dissolve back into furniture and clothes and ordinary objects. But remember what it came to tell you. Rest, heal, restore, reconnect. Because the shadows only appear when you need them most. When you're pushing too hard against your limits. When you're running too long on too little sleep, too little peace, too little care. They are the warning before the collapse. The whisper before the scream. The signal before the system fails. Listen to them. Not with fear, though the fear will come, but with understanding, with recognition, with acceptance. Your mind is speaking to you in shadow language. It's time to listen, time to respond, time to care for the nervous system that works so hard to care for you. Because the real mystery isn't what you see in the darkness. The real mystery isn't whether shadows can exist without light to cast them. The real mystery is what you discover about yourself when you finally face those shadows and recognize them as your own, as aspects of you projected outward, as your fear, your vigilance, your exhaustion, your ancient inheritance, the watcher and the watched, the shadow and the self, one and the same, always have been. You are both the person in the bed and the figure in the corner, both the consciousness that wakes and the presence that watches, both the experiencer and the experience. This is the strange loop of awareness, the recursive nature of consciousness, the mind observing itself and creating division where none truly exists. Stay curious about your own mind. Stay aware of its tricks and tendencies. Stay compassionate toward its ancient fears and modern struggles. And when you wake to darkness, as you will again, know that you are witnessing something profound. Your own mind, vast and ancient and impossibly complex, doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting you from dangers real and imagined, seeing threats in every shadow because once long ago some of those shadows were real, and the ones who saw them survived, and you are their legacy, their gift to the future, their evolutionary success story, even from nothing, especially from nothing, because in the end, the shadows you see are the ones you need to see until you don't need them anymore, until your nervous system finds peace, until your stress subsides, until your sleep deepens, until your life becomes sustainable again. Then they'll fade, not because you've conquered them, but because you've healed what generated them. And that's the real victory, not fighting the shadows, but addressing what casts them, not denying the experience, but transforming the conditions that create it. So let them come when they must. Let them deliver their message. Let them show you what needs attention. Then do the work of healing, of resting, of caring for the magnificent, mysterious machinery of your mind, because you deserve peace. You deserve rest. You deserve nights without watchers and days without fear. You deserve to wake in darkness and find only darkness, only silence, only peace. And one day, if you listen to the shadows now, if you heed their warnings, if you do the work they're asking of you, that peace will come, the shadows will retreat, the watchers will dissolve, the darkness will be just darkness again, empty, harmless, restful. Until then, stay awake to what they're telling you. Stay aware of your own needs. Stay compassionate toward your own struggles. The shadows are not your enemies. They never were. They're the part of you that refuses to let you harm yourself through neglect. The part that loves you enough to frighten you, to warn you, to remind you you are human, you are vulnerable, you are worthy of care, especially your own, most especially your own. So when the shadow appears tonight, tomorrow, next week, meet it with understanding rather than terror, with curiosity rather than panic, with gratitude for the warning it brings. Then turn on the light, not just the lamp beside your bed, but the light of awareness, the light of self-care, the light of compassion for your own exhausted nervous system. That's the light that finally dispels the shadows, not by fighting them, but by healing what creates them. Rest well, wake peacefully, and know that the shadows, should they come, are simply old friends, ancient protectors, familiar guardians, trying, in their own terrifying way, to keep you safe, to keep you whole, to keep you alive, just as they always have, just as they always will, until you no longer need them, and then quietly, gratefully, they'll let you sleep.